Hey, so in this video I'm going to talk about CSS pseudo elements. So these are elements that you create with CSS rather than HTML. So you can create them with Microthemer. And it saves you having to go into Gutenberg or your page builder or whatever it is you use to build content for the page. It saves you having to go in and just add, say, an empty div or a span element just to make a style change that you can't do without having this extra element. So to give you an example, if I click on this heading here, and then I'm going to expand the advanced options so we can see the HTML for this element here. So it's a H2. So what you see here, these are all normal HTML elements with the blue bits either side of the text. And so this is a regular H2 element. If we wanted to do the equivalent of inserting a span element here, like just before the word what we can do is we can use a before pseudo selector. So to create one with Microthemer, there's a couple of options. One that's been around for a long time is where you can, when you're targeting something, so I've clicked on this and Microthemer's coming up with some CSS selectors here, which you can see a bit more clearly down here. And if I enable this before option, what it does is it adds this little bit of code to the end, and that essentially creates a pseudo selector. So if I save this, the other important thing you need to do before the pseudo element, creates a pseudo element, there's a difference between a pseudo class and a pseudo element. So a pseudo element, what we're creating here with these before option, what that does is create like an element that's like a real HTML element, but it's created with CSS. And so in order for that to complete making that, we need to set the content property. It can be an empty string like this, and you see that now the HTML pane's updated to show that, yeah, we've got a before element here. Or it could be some text. So I could change this to so, comma, and then now our heading reads, so what is a CSS pseudo element? So this is quite interesting, the fact that you can, using this very specific method here, add some text to the page with CSS, which is not normally what you do with CSS. Normally it's just for styling. But yeah, you can occasionally, there's a use for adding some text. But quite often what you want to do is, say, add something visual. So there's now another option for creating pseudo elements, and it's these create sector variation options. So there's the before option and the after option. I created a before pseudo element selector just now using the targeting options. I can take a shortcut and create an after element just by using this option here. And what that does is, if we've got this starter styles option enabled, it just sort of creates a pink little box just so we can see where it is. I can turn that off. You don't always have to have that on. So it's just useful for like positioning it, because sometimes with pseudo elements, you set the syntax of ... after, and then you try and set some width or height or something. It doesn't quite work. And it can be a bit confusing as to whether or not you've actually created one. So this starter style thing just makes it very explicit by setting display inline to block, and also just giving it a bit of width and a bit of height. So for instance, now that I can see this on the page, I'm going to go ahead and position it. So I'll just go ahead and save this first, actually, and then if I select the main element and just set the positioning context to relative, and what that means is when I position any of the elements inside this element, and these before and after pseudo elements are considered inside, they're like children of the H2 main element. If I position these elements with position absolute, then it'll be relative to this container here. So I'm going to position this after element at the bottom right in a second. So let's go ahead and do that. So now with our position relative set here, I can select the pseudo element, and this is a new thing in Microthemer where you can actually visually click on pseudo elements to select them. So I'm going to set this to absolute, and then I'm going to say I want it to appear at the bottom and the bottom right. So I'll set this to 0. What that means is the right edge of this pseudo element aligns with the right edge of the main element, and the bottom edge aligns with the bottom edge of the main element. And so now I can go ahead and just maybe tweak the sizing. I'm just going to set this to, I don't know, 90 and this to 90, so it's a little bit bigger. And then I could go ahead and use the image mask feature to create an image out of this. So I'm just going to find the eagle option, and I'll set that to the size to cover or contain maybe. Yeah, and I don't want it to repeat. No repeat. And then I could, in fact, I'm going to make it a little bit larger as well. I'm going to say 190 and by 190 in size. And then I could position this rather than positioning it on the to overlap. Oh, actually, before I position it, just to show you, so it's overlapping the text a bit here. So if I go to the z-index option and I set that to -1, then it now appears behind the text. And the bottom, I could actually move it down a bit, and I'm going to actually, maybe don't even need the overlap, maybe have it over here. So this is one of the things you can do with a pseudo element that you couldn't do with a background image. You see that the main H2 element goes to, from that highlighting, you can see it sort of goes up to the eagle. And so what you could do to achieve this effect, if we hadn't dragged it outside the boundary, would be just to set a background image of say, this eagle and position it at the bottom right. But with pseudo elements, because we've got our own element, we can position it wherever we want on the whole page. So you've got a little bit more flexibility there. So let's move on to another example now. We've inserted some text. We've added an image. We can turn this into a speech bubble now as well. This is another example. So to begin with, I'll just create a selector for this heading here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create, I'm going to use the before pseudo element to create the circle, the ellipse, and then I'll use an after element to add a little tick to the ellipse so it looks like a speech bubble. So to begin with, I'm just going to make this into a bit more square. So I will set the width to say 500, the height to 500, and maybe that's a bit too much actually, 300. And I will set the padding to say 80 pixels, and then I'll just align that centered. There we go. Now if I go ahead and create my before pseudo element using the shortcut here, I'll just turn off the starter styles. I'm going to set the width to say 100%, and the height to 100%, and I will set the position. Oh, I tell you what, I will set the position to relative first. Remember to do that, and then on the before element, sometimes it's easiest to select to go back to the before element by using the HTML pane if you just click on it. And I'll set that to absolute, and I'll set the background color to this yellow. I'll set the z-index so it doesn't appear on top, so it appears behind. I'll set that to -1. I will set the top option to 0, the left option to 0. So now it just fully fills. So it's width 100% and height 100%, but aligned with the top left. So it basically takes up the exact same space as the element, the container H2 element. Now I'll go to the shapes and masks properties, and I'll set an ellipse. And you can adjust the points of the ellipse in Microthemer using the slider, or I'm going to hold down the Alt key and use my mouse wheel to just move that up a little bit, like so. So it's a bit taller. And so now we've got our ellipse defined, and the reason we define this again using a before element rather than just setting it on the H2 element is that when you set clip path, what you're doing is you're basically cropping anything outside of this ellipse shape here. So with our tick that we're going to add, that would get cropped out if it was on the H2 element, because the clip path crops anything inside the H2. So because our after won't be inside the before, where we've got our ellipse, then it won't get cropped. So Again, the quick way to do this is to use the after option here. As I am actually going to have my starter styles here, so I can position this. So I'm going to set the position to absolute, and we're going to say bottom and right 0 initially. Maybe right, actually, we probably want to adjust this a little bit. So this direction, yeah, about there, and then bottom we probably want it to move up a little bit, maybe like here. Okay, and then I will make it slightly bigger. So let's say we probably want it to be a square, but let's say 50 by 50. Yeah, and then I'll go back to the shape options, and I'll just choose a triangle from the list, and then we just need to maybe transform this a little bit, rotate it round. So if I go to transform, I'm going to rotate it. So rotate Z is the one where sort of what you normally think of as rotating, just around its axis like this. Yeah, maybe that's about the right position. And then I could tweak the position using this value here. I could use the translate options in the transform, but I might as well keep things simple here by just adjusting this absolute positioning. Yeah, that's about right. And then now we just want to give it a Z index of, say, -2, and then so it appears behind. And that, if it's all a solid color, it doesn't really matter if it appears behind or in front, but it gives us a bit more options. I actually think I want to create a little bit more, a little bit bigger, and then we'll just set the same color. So instead of the pink, we'll just use the same yellow color. And then there we have it. So if I just remove the highlighting, we can see we've got our speech bubble now. So let's quickly move on to another example where we're going to add an image next to this paragraph of text here. So first of all, I'm going to select this paragraph, and then I'm going to go to the grid options and just create 2 columns. What that does is when you've got one element that's just got some text inside it, and you use grid to create columns, what it does is it just treats the text as almost as an element in itself, like it's called a text node. And so that fills up one of the columns, leaving space for something else on the right. So if we were to then set an after pseudo element, like we've done here, I'm going to turn off actually I don't mean to turn it off, I'll just go to the width and height options and just change it to say 100% by width and 100% height. And so essentially in our grid, what's happening here is it's treating the text node as the first element in the grid, and then after as another element. And so now we've got some columns, so I can just set a background image on this. So if I go to the image library, and then I'll just choose this image here and insert that, and then set the size to cover, perhaps. Yeah. That's fine, and then that way you can just, without having to go in and edit the HTML anyway, you can just easily add an image next to some text to make the text a bit more attractive. So font awesome icons also use pseudo elements. So the traditional way to load a font awesome icon is to add classes to your HTML markup. But sometimes there might be times where you just want to use CSS to add your Font Awesome icon. Now, the first step is to make sure that Font Awesome is loaded onto your page. And your theme might already do that, or your builder. And you can do this yourself manually, writing some PHP code, or there's, if you just want a quick way to do this, you can actually just import it via Microthemer's full code editor. So if I go to the full code view, oh, by the way, I just used a keyboard shortcut then, but you go to view, full code editor, and so you switch this. And here you can just enter any kind of CSS you like, including import statements. So I'm just going to paste in the rule for importing Font Awesome style sheet like this. And then if I go back to the visual view and then say I select this element here, I'm going to save this actually and then just use my shortcut to create an after pseudo element, or a before one actually. And then save that, and I'm going to set the font family first to Font Awesome 5. Font Awesome 5.3, that just happens to be the library that I've imported here. The name of it, Font Awesome is now on version 6, and it might be later when you're watching this video. And then if I go to Font Awesome, and whatever icon you want to choose, say you click on, say I want to choose this star icon, it gives you like a Unicode value here. So if I click to copy that, and then I go back to Microthemer, I just need to go to the content value and set, do a backslash, hang on, I'll just remove that space, and then paste in my Unicode value that I just copied from Font Awesome. Let me just get rid of the color. We don't need that. And we also don't need to have the width and height, so actually I didn't really need the starter styles in that instance. So now we've got a star here. So that's something that just adds a bit of extra flexibility, again, when it's, say, not that convenient or possible to edit the markup, the HTML markup. Maybe you're working on a header and a footer and you don't actually have direct access to it. Then you can still add icons using this method here. And now for a slightly more complicated example, I'll show you how to create a tooltip just using CSS code. So we're going to select this element here. I'm going to create a selector for this. And then I'm going to go ahead and create my before, or maybe I'll call it an after. It doesn't really matter. You know, when you're positioning things, using absolute positioning to say move before or after you don't, it really doesn't matter which you choose some of the time, because even though the default positioning of, say, this after is here, we're going to move it to just, say, the center below this bit here, which we could have just as easily done with the before pseudo element. So I'm going to save this, and actually I'm going to set, again, I'm going to set the positioning context to relative here. I'm also going to set this to display inline block, because at the moment you see it fills, by default a list item just fills the full width of its container, but if I set this to inline block, then it will only fill it'll only be as wide as the text, and that's can be useful when we're going to try and position this tooltip in the center here. So going back to the after element here that we've got, if I set the position property to absolute, and then I'm going to move it, I'm going to say top, I'm going to use a predefined option here, top 100%, so it just means below it, and then I will set the left to 50%. Okay, and then I'm going to also just set some placeholder text. Okay, placeholder text. Okay, and let's also remove the width and the height that have been explicitly set here. And when you absolutely position things, sometimes the text will wrap like this. So what we want to do is go to the word wrap option and say, the white space option and say no wrap. Okay, so now our tooltip will always be on one line. And so it's kind of centered in the sense that it starts halfway through the parent element, but because of the content, it's not quite centered because it's actually got quite a long bit of content here. So the solution there is, the other step is to go to the transform options and set the translate across the horizontal axis to minus 50%. And now it'll always appear centered. So setting the position left 50% and then translate X to 50%, that's the way to center things like this when there's a variable amount of content both on the container and in this case the tooltip. So I'll also just add a little bit more styling to the font size. I want it to be relatively a bit smaller, or I could go with a fixed value like something like that, and then I'll give it a little bit of padding. We want the top and bottom padding to be the same, and the left and right padding to be the same. So it can be a bit quicker to write this by hand. Padding, I'm going to say, so the top and bottom padding I'm going to set to, say, 0.4 rem. And then I'm going to set the left and right padding to, say, 1.4 rem. Yeah, maybe that's okay. Maybe 1.5. And then I'm also going to set the border radius down here to, let's just turn off this so we can see what we're working on a bit more clearly. And I'm going to maybe just create a full kind of pill. And I'm going to set the color. So Microthemer has an option, if you expand the more colors, for sampling the site colors. You can resample at any time. But this will this analyzes the style sheet and just picks up colors that your theme is already using. So for consistency, I might set this blue, and then I'll just set, to make the text a bit more readable, I'll just set that to white. And then we also just need to, so right now it's just the tooltip is appearing all the time. We want it to appear on hover, okay? So to do that, what I'll do is I'll hide it by default. So I'll go to the tooltip, which also has display block just from when we set some starter styles. Microthemer sets display inline block because otherwise the width and height properties don't actually have any effect, because by default a before or after pseudo element has display inline. And just due to a quirk of the display inline, it has an effect with other properties, and such that width and height don't actually have any effect. So I'm going to set this to none. Okay, so now it's not displaying. And then what I'm going to do is create another selector. So if I just target the main element that is always visible, the li element in this case, and if I go to create additional selector, and then I'm just going to set my my modifiers here. So I'm going to say on hovering over that and then targeting the after pseudo element, let's save that. Let's set this to display, could be block, could be inline block. And so now when I hover over it, it appears, and when I'm off, it disappears. So now what we want to do is go back to the selector where we set most of the styles. So you notice here it's now showing there we've got two selectors that target our pseudo element, our after pseudo element. This is the first one. And instead of having placeholder text, I'll tell you what, I'll just turn off the display none so we can see what we're doing. But instead of having placeholder text, what we can do, if you look at the HTML here, you notice that I've set data tooltip equals and then a value. That's often, when you're working with tooltips, that's often the best way to do it if you do have control over the HTML, just because then you can set some global styles for making tooltips appear and be designed in a specific way. And then the only thing you have to do is add this attribute to something for it to work. So instead of having some hard-coded text, placeholder text, what we can do is reference the data tooltip attribute. So the syntax for this is, and Microthemer has some of these examples just to help you get started, but if you look for the one that says attribute or attr and then brackets, what I can do is change that from, because it's not a href, it's the attribute is called data tooltip, and then now it's actually including this text here visually. And then that's how you create a tooltip purely with CSS and with Microthemer. So to finish, I'm just going to show you one more thing. This is something I covered in a previous video on CSS shapes and masks. And that's what also gave me the idea that the pseudo element management in Microthemer, there's some extra tools I could add to make this a bit easier. So one of which is actually showing the before and after pseudo element in the HTML, just like DevTools does. And the other feature that was added more recently was this variation option, so you can easily create them. Okay, so I'm going to create a selector for this footer to begin with, and I'll just set the background color to something with a bit more contrast. I'm going to use the site red here. And then I will also set the font color to white so the text is a bit more readable, and I'll need to select this option here and holding shift to select them both at the same time. That sent me to the top. So just bring that down and then set the color to white for this as well. And then going back to the footer, if I then use the variation option to create a before pseudo element, and I don't want the starter styles for this, what I can do is I'll also set the position value to relative again, as we want to, whenever you want to use absolute positioning, basically you want to set positioning to relative, and then let's go back and create our before element here. Save that, and I'm going to set the height and width to I'll set the width to 100%, and I'll set the height to I don't know, maybe 90 pixels, and then I'll set the position property to absolute, and then I'm going to set the bottom to 100%. I think I've already used that in the past. So that appears there like that, and I'll set the background color to just exactly the same as the footer. So I think that's this color here. So now when I'm going to create some waves to cut out of this area here to give like the footer a wavy top. And the reason I'm using a before pseudo element here is that this footer could be any height. Some footers have quite a lot of information in, and when we're setting like this shape, I'll just add it now. Might make a bit more sense. So I'm going to set this to waves top, and I'm going to set the size to cover, so it's a bit more wavy. If we were to set this on, say, a very tall element, then the waves would cut off some of the content. So what we want to do is have this, just have like a defined height thin layer to just tack on the top of it, so that it looks like it's part of the same thing, but then we have a lot more control over the way the waves divide the content. And that's it. Let's just turn this off so we can see what we're looking at. So yeah, we've looked at quite a few examples of using before and after pseudo elements. They come in quite handy for little design tricks. So I hope the recent additions to Microthemer for making it a bit easier to work with them is going to be useful for you. So thank you very much for watching.